Okay. Equipment is seemingly working, so I'm sorry about this.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay. So last time I was recording everything and forgot to put the microphone in, and then my laptop's microphone didn't do a very good job. So actually, the recording, if you got a chance to listen to it, is not particularly great. So hopefully it's gonna be working better this time around. Okay, so today we have a really complicated task for a variety of reasons. So first, David Ricardo is a complex thinker, and his ideas are complex. Second, his writing style is not particularly appealing. And then the structure of his thought is very often like geometric or deductive. Far less filled with empirical evidence and examples, like as Adam Smith, for example, does, which can create some problems. Sometimes we need illustrations to understand complex content that he puts forward. But I hope that it was worth your while to try and read these excerpts from the major work that Ricardo wrote, History of Political Economy and Taxation. All of the major ideas that he developed are in this book, although you can find here and there them formulated in other pamphlets and shorter pieces and so on. Particularly one controversy that is not covered here that I will say something at the very beginning here, but that we haven't read about in the book, is the controversy over the banking policy, monetary policy, so-called Pullionist controversy. Or how to. That was a debate that was raging in 1810s, 20s, even to 1830s, while about fractional reserve banking versus full reserve banking, paper money, for paper money or against paper money. So the variety of people chiming in and debating this issue. So David Ricardo was influential in this regard as one of the foremost proponents of the sound money, commodity money, and opponents of fractional reserve banking and opponents of paper money as such, which is kind of interesting twist because, as you had read probably in this short introduction, and if you haven't read anything about David Ricardo, he was a stockbroker, stock market guru. He was actually known for earning a great deal of money on the stock market in the city of London. He retired, I think, in his early 40s or something. So he started his career early to mid-20s, and by 41, 42, he earned enough money so he could withdraw to his mansion someplace in the countryside and spend the entire rest of his life as a journalist, public commentator. He also ran for the parliament eventually. I think he was elected as a representative in House of Commons in England. He was good friends with another guy who belonged to this classical school of economics, James Mill. James Mill was an economist, student, not direct student, but a follower of Adam Smith's, and a preeminent economist in his own right. and he was a very good friend with Ricardo. Some historians of economic ideas like Schumpeter and Robert, who are not very sympathetic to Ricardo, say that Mill might have his hand in formulating some of Ricardo's major ideas. So it was Mill who convinced Ricardo to run in a parliament, and I think that Ricardo spent, I forgot this, I haven't read a lot, it was just a year or two, actually. In a parliament, he didn't do particularly well, which is not surprising. Economists are typically not very convincing demagogues and political operatives. So the plan that concocted by James Mill and Ricardo was to, not only James Mill, but the entire group of people around him, to use Ricardo as an avatar, to use Ricardo as a spokesman, as a spokesperson for this new political economy in the British Parliament. It didn't turn out to work so well as they have hoped. So Ricardo, you may think to yourself, what a strange last name for an Englishman. David. Okay, David is fine. David sounds English enough, but Ricardo. And actually, David Ricardo was David Ricardo, Portuguese Jew. His parents were Portuguese Jews who immigrated to England when he was young, I believe. And when he was 21, 22, he decided to marry a Quaker girl. And as a consequence of that, he became a Christian, and his parents disavowed him. He never met them until they died. He was baptized and became Christian. And from Portuguese boy David Ricardo, he became an English stockbroker and later English economist David Ricardo. So I don't know whether he actually spoke Portuguese at all. He wrote everything that survived in English, and for all intents and purposes, he was an Englishman. So, how he came to be an economist? So he started as a practical man of practical affairs, as an investor on Wall Street. I was going to say Wall Street, in the city of London. As a stockbroker, that was his primary. Dealing primarily in government bonds. That was his bond dealing. That was his main financial occupation. He never read in his youth, in his teens, in his early 20s, he never published anything. It was completely practical. I think when he was 26 or 27, for the first time, he stumbled upon a copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations while he was vacationing someplace. I think it was Bath, the famous vacation destination in southern England, built by the Romans, by the way. So while in Bath, he came across Wealth of Nations and he read it in one fell swoop, and he was completely taken in by Adam Smith's arguments, and he became an economist. For the first time in his life, he became a man interested in theoretical issues, and it was Adam Smith's merit or blame, or however you want to call it, for this conversion of David Ricardo from a financial guru to economic theorist. So there was an entire group of people who will converge in the early 19th century, an array of writers in England and France who were all introduced to economics by Adam Smith, and who were in one way or another Smithians, so people who were writing in the Smithian tradition and criticizing Smith for certain ideas and trying to improve upon Adam Smith's solutions and theories in the Wealth of Nations. So you'll have David Ricardo in England, obviously, then James Mill, later on John Stuart Mill, more well-known Mill the son, was also a first-rate economist, maybe even better than his father. Then you have Thomas Malthus, Reverend Thomas Malthus, who we are going to read next week. His famous essay on population and his debate with David Ricardo about business cycle. So that was one of the first modern macroeconomic debates between Ricardo and Malthus. You will see that very few things are, one of my colleagues said probably correctly, that there is nothing new in the world except for Jesus. That's maybe the only novelty that he has seen in history. All other things are essentially just repeat themselves this way, one way or another. So this is, you will see when we read about this debate about the business cycle next week, that Malthus was in a sense a prefiguration of John Maynard Keynes. Actually, that he developed the ideas about the insufficient aggregate demand and the inherently unstable character of the market system and so on for the first time in the early 19th century. So Keynes was not particularly well versed into the history of economic ideas. He didn't know about that, but essentially Malthus was a pre-Keynesian, was a Keynes before Keynes, while Ricardo represented this classical tradition that will become in the 20th century also defended by people like Ludwig von Mises or F.A. Hayek, this idea that market is a self-regulating mechanism, that you don't need any external intervention to equilibrate it, that there is no, the cause of the business cycle, the cause of recessions cannot be the insufficiency of spending or aggregate demand, but other causes about which we can do very little, if anything. So this is a group of people who refined, criticized, improved upon Smith's ideas. Jean-Baptiste Say is a very important French thinker, follower of Adam Smith. So most of these men were more original thinkers than Adam Smith. That's a paradoxical situation, that you have a guru of the entire group who established this school. This is the classical school of economics, begins with Adam Smith. And yet all of these men, Malthus, Ricardo, Mill the father, Mill the son, Jean-Baptiste Say in France, all of them were, as pure theoreticians, more important and more original thinkers than Adam Smith. As I said, Adam Smith was a great systematizer of economic thought. He was great in adducing empirical evidence and good examples to illustrate his ideas. He was great in formulating clearly and concisely his ideas. But as theoreticians, all of these men are probably more important, historically speaking. Certainly more influential in the sense of the technical ideas that they produced than Adam Smith. And we will see one of the examples just to illustrate this for you. To what extent Karl Marx, whom we are going to read about in 2 weeks or so, maybe 3 weeks, was influenced by David Ricardo. That's astonishing. You will recognize that the key concepts of Karl Marx's theory were already developed chapter and verse in David Ricardo. He just took them and slightly reinterpreted them and derived different kinds of implications. But the analytical content of the theory was essentially Ricardian. So then after Ricardo's death, the entire school of thinkers called the not neo-Ricardians, so Ricardian socialists. So that was the first surprise. David Ricardo, who was a big free market fundamentalist, even you can call him, in every respect, who didn't believe in big government intervention, and so on. People who were following in his footsteps after he died were socialists, almost without exceptions. And Karl Marx belonged to that group of Ricardian socialists. He was a kind of apostate of that group, who went a few steps further than most of them. But nevertheless, that was the milieu within which Karl Marx, the theory of wages and profit, and the iron law of wages, and subsistence theory of wages, and the struggle between the owners of capital and labor for social product, the very concept of class struggle, all of this ideas you find explicitly formulated, sometimes even linguistically, the exact same. Karl Marx's German expressions are just translations from English from Ricardo, sometimes not clearly linguistically the same, but content-wise essentially the same. And one of the things that we are going to cover today is those ideas. I will turn your attention to those ideas that became prominent later on in the Marxian formulation. So of course, we can say that there are multiple important contributions that Ricardo made to economic theory. One of them is not provided with a marker. Refinement of the theory of price and value. Say refinement and authoritative formulation of the state-of-the-art price theory of the classical school of economics. What David Ricardo did on the first few pages on this excerpt that we read today was essentially the theory of price, the theory of value and price, until 1873, when Menger and Jevons published their books, essentially revising completely the entire concept and introducing the theory of subjective value and marginal utility and so on. So this first that would be page 200 and 68, 69, 70. On value, chapter 1, is the beginning of the book. So I'll come back to this theory, and otherwise it's just to enumerate some of the contributions that he made. Then the Ricardian theory of rent. Rent is an income accruing to the owners of land, income of land. In many ways, this theory remained in many quarters the leading theory of rent until today. So one economist of the late 19th century, economist Alfred Marshall, about whom you might have heard. Alfred Marshall was a great Ricardian. And this theory of rent was repudiated, as you will read in the later part of the semester, when we read the criticisms of Marshall and Ricardo by Americans. That one topic that is covered in my book that we're going to read some excerpts from. Alfred Marshall completely swallowed hook, line, and sinker the Ricardian theory of rent. And to the extent that Alfred Marshall's microeconomic theory, Alfred Marshall's famous book, Principles of Economics, published in 1895, is essentially the cornerstone of modern microeconomics textbooks, most of them. Even the one that you read with me in microeconomics was the Alchian and Allen, which is one of the best ones. It is still based on the Ricardian or the Marshallian theory. And then is correspondingly, to the extent that Marshall was a Ricardian through and through, to Ricardo's. So this theory of rent is important for many reasons. That it pertains to the theory of distribution. It's the cornerstone of the theory of distribution. Uses one analytical device that Ricardo was not fully aware of the significance of this principle. It's the principle of diminishing returns. Then, the next crucial thing about Ricardo is that he established a theory of distribution as the key problem of political economy. The problem of distribution. How is that different from Adam Smith? It's different insofar as the main problem for Adam Smith was the production and exchange. So that's Smith, production and exchange. How do we know this? We know how Adam Smith begins Wealth of Nations. Disquisitions on specialization and division of labor. That's the entire theory of production. Have that. And also you have the entire third part of the book, like 35% of the book is the theory of international trade, theory of exchange. Distribution for him is a kind of side issue. For Ricardo, that's a center stage. Who gets what? That's the key. Who gets what in the process of production? More importantly, Ricardo establishes one principle that later on John Stuart Mill would formulate most precisely. Ricardo is not quite consistent here, but he hints at this idea, or he rather implicitly assumes it, even if he doesn't say in so many words what I'm about to say. This is the idea that production is one process which is independent from distribution. That means that the production and exchange of goods and services, the market economy, consists of two separate processes that are characterized by separate laws or separate causal chains, separate principles that explain it. Production, that's your comparative advantage or specialization, division of labor, and so on. That's this entire theory. And then you have distribution. That's a theory of wages, rent, and profit. So the main problem is how total output doesn't work anymore. How is total output that is produced and divided up among landowners, capitalists, and workers? Landowners get rents, capitalists get profit and interest, workers get wages. So what laws can we discern for the process of distribution? Because it's a separate process from production. So you have this idea which in Ricardo is somehow taken for granted, never formulated explicitly, this idea that we as society first produce goods and services, and then we have to decide somehow by some other mechanism how to divide it up, who is going to get what. He said that this is the real cornerstone of modern socialism. This idea that it's the goods and services that are produced and sold, the distribution of income resulting from the free exchange of goods and services is not the final say, is not the final word. There is something more to be done in addition to that. Or the distribution should be understood in a different way. We'll come back to this. The relationship between, so the cornerstone of his theory of distribution is the relationship between rent, profit, and wages. Which laws determine this interplay between these three types of incomes. And he will develop one thing, for example, just one quick quotation for you to illustrate, to defend my claim that Ricardo was Marx before Marx. On page 278, about this specific issue distribution, it says, there can be no rise in the value of labor without a fall of profits. If the corn is to be divided between the farmer and the laborer, the larger the proportion that is given to the latter, the less will remain for the former. Here is your theory of class struggle, Karl Marx. There is a constant value that is being produced, and how it is going to be distributed, it's a struggle between the owner of capital and laborer. More is there for one of them, less will remain for the other. This competitive, zero-sum image of the economic process is in plain sight here, David Ricardo. Okay, so that's the theory of distribution. That's maybe the key cornerstone. His theory, and finally we have the theory of comparative advantage, well known for all of you. That's in old news. You learned that in both your micro and macro classes. You know what is that? So David Ricardo is the guy who formulated the concept in its a long time dominant form, and who gave it the name. So another general idea which we take for granted and find it ever present is not actually ever present and natural. It was formulated for the first time by somebody. That's one of the discoveries, actually, when you read. I have that experience in Serbian language. When you grow up and you read stuff, and you discovered something similar in your mother tongue, in English. That you take certain sentences, certain pieces of wisdom for granted. You somehow take them as naturally existing, as somehow popular wisdom. And then as you get more educated and you read more, you actually realize that most of these things were said by somebody. They have the author, somebody who formulated it for the first time, and then they became popular wisdom. That applies even more, of course, it goes without saying, for economic truisms and economic general principles and so on. As somebody has formulated them for the first time. Maybe the measure of greatness of an economist is to what extent his ideas became common wisdom. Or is it? What do you think about that? Can we judge the greatness of an economist? Just a slight footnote here, we'll come back to Ricardo. Can we judge the greatness of an economist by how many of his ideas became common wisdom that people were not aware of? So Keynes would say, actually, that practical men and politicians, that they think they're particularly original, but what they typically do in their demagoguery and political agitation is just they repeat the ideas of some defunct economist, some dead professor who wrote a generation or two ago, or 3 generations ago. Is this true? Is this a true measure of greatness of an economist? How many practical men and women nowadays of practical affairs are repeating like parrots your ideas without knowing what are they repeating, what they are repeating? Or maybe not. What do you think about it?
I'd say that's a good way to look at it. I mean, if they're still talked about, like, they might not be named specifically, but their theories are. So the fact that they still exist is kind of a testament to their.
Okay. Is the measure of greatness whether the ideas are present and discussed in some way or another, or whether they are accepted, taken for granted? These two are different issues. Taken as truism, as something self-evident. this kind of methodological question. What is the, can we trust the evolution of social science to give us better and better theories over time? To what extent? What do you think? I kind of opened my cards at the beginning. I said what I thought about that. But I hope that you might have forgotten at least some of that. So as you can now speak freely. Can economics go backwards? Can social science go backwards? So you're students of social science, most of you are politics majors. No. Is there any, your politics major, who else? Nobody else. Oh, okay. I don't want to now pick on you people who are politics majors. Maybe Riley, you can share some ideas with us about how that works in political theory, political philosophy, you study that.
Well, as far as devolution of theory, it's practically possible, but it's not so more like educational possible. Like you look at examples such as Nazi Germany, who physically removed educational material in an effort to focus on one theoretical theme, but in its essence, it doesn't really devolve since it still exists. But I guess in a actual sense, I guess it could.
So you could, but it's gonna come back. You cannot destroy it. Is that your point? So if it's worth anything, it's gonna come back sooner or later. Would you go as far as this,
Yeah.
or maybe not?
See, if it's beneficial in any way, shape, or form, then it should continue to exist.
Okay, others. If it's beneficial, how would you? Just please go ahead.
I was just thinking of the example of toleration in the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment is kind of credited with, creating this term of toleration or whatever, but in fact, the Catholic Church, the early Catholic writers, posited that argument of toleration, and it was kind of forgotten and then rediscovered. So I think that can be similar to economic thought in a sense of where sometimes these concepts are just kind of forgotten and new philosophers just kind of rediscover it. So I think there is value in that rediscovery.
So then your suggestion would be that the economic knowledge could be lost depending on the circumstances. So then it can devolve, as Riley said, it can go, things can go backwards maybe in future theories. Go ahead.
I guess I was going to say, if it's something that people really believe in and really want to keep, then it'll stay.
So you think if people really want to believe something, then the ideas will remain. So you're positing here that some non-theoretical interests might have upper hand in determining what is going to be the orthodoxy of the day in social science and economics, political theory, and so on. If I correctly interpret what you said. Yeah.
I'd push back on that a little bit, because most of the time when people write like this, when they're writing it is not the commonly held theories.
Okay.
So it's basically not until the next generation that their theories kind of get adopted. So that if you're just going off of what people believe, then it kind of demeans the fact that economic thought is independent of current thought.
Current political climate, let's say, or intellectual climate, maybe a better word. Okay.
So you're saying that economic thought doesn't follow.
Well, I'm saying economic thought exists outside of just popular opinion.
So you want to say actually that the motivations, likely reasons why people write economics stuff is not to reflect the prevailing intellectual framework of the age, that they might be writing actually to lead the way in reconceptualizing things, in seeing them in a new fashion, that intellectuals in social science are not so much people who reflect the ideas of their own time and age and their own country. There are people who believe that Hegel, German philosopher, said it's a philosophy is just your own time captured in thought, just the product of your time. You just formulate on a slightly higher level of abstraction what everybody believes right now, intellectual consensus of the time. That's philosophy. What you're suggesting here is not. It's very much different. It's actually the idea that the original ideas exist all the time, and they change. They predominantly influence what is going to be this prevailing intellectual climate all the time, and that to that degree, then practical interests might not be crucial in determining what is going to be, what kind of ideas are going to be formulated. I agree with that, but I think that she insisted on something slightly different, that what ideas will be prevailing, what economic theories will be more widely accepted, will be determined by the prevailing spirit of the age. So one example of this, if I can defend, or slightly try to reconcile actually what two of you are saying, actually, there is no necessary contradiction here. So John Maynard Keynes wrote his general theory of employment in 1930s. He was he was similar in many respects to Ricardo. He was a successful businessman in the stock market and so on. He wrote this because he has a spat with F.A. Hayek, who criticized him, and he reformulated his ideas, and he came up with this idea that the government needs to control the aggregate demand, spending, and so on, this entire macroeconomic theory, and that became unorthodox. It's this happy confluence of his theoretical influence and the prevailing spirit of the age. So he was not motivated by some idea to influence practical policy, but he succeeded in doing so because his ideas were in tune with what majority of educated population at that time believed. People wanted more stronger government. 1930s were a period where socialism was growing, that socialist ideas were growing. So his Keynes's technical economic ideas that he developed for their own sake were in tune with what people believed and wanted to believe at that time and age. So I have a Hayek, he's a good friend from the London School of Economics, who writes completely different stuff of the bygone age, like self-regulating free market and so on. He gets forgotten almost overnight, 1930s, 1940s. He joked that Keynes died in 1946 and he was elevated into sainthood in a sense. Died relatively young, 60 years. His father was still alive. That's one of the grossest things. Whenever I hear about something like that, that's John Abel Keynes, he was a mathematician and social theorist. His own, right? Hayek was forgotten. And then in 1970s, Hayek was, I'm telling you just the story to illustrate this possibility to reconcile these two ideas. Hayek got so disappointed with this fact, what he considered to be the sliding of the free world into some kind of soft totalitarianism. So he started to drink in 1950s and 60s. His ex-wife claimed that he wanted to kill himself because he was convinced that the Western world would completely go into pieces. And the acceptance of the Keynesian ideas for him was just the reflection of this Western world going mad. And then what happened in the 1970s, the crisis of Keynesianism, people changed their minds in the Western world. And then Hayek's ideas became popular once again. So he didn't change very much. His ideas didn't change, the climate changed. He got the Nobel Prize in economics in 1974. And he started once again writing about economics for the first time after 3 years. So then neither Hayek nor Keynes were people who who were writing for a general public, for policymakers. They were not think tank. You know what think tanks are nowadays. So research institutes that provide, from a specific ideological perspective, policy briefs for politicians that try to influence senators and presidents and congressmen, providing the policy solutions based on their own particular ideas. So they have whatever. Brookings Institute and what is the Center for American Progress on the left wing. You have Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute on the conservative side, and they write papers and policy briefs for politicians and so on. So they try to influence public opinion by using the tools of theoretical study. And you have economists who work for think tank. I was about to start to become one in 2016. 3 or 4 weeks. I was about to sign a contract, then I got this opportunity here, and I said, okay. And I'm happy about it right now. And I felt very bad about this, that you are defined by your mission, which is to influence the public opinion to go into specific direction. What if you don't believe that in some particular, let's say, context, this vision is justified. So it is important to bear in mind always the significance of this independence of economic ideas from political climate. And one more thing, final thing here. We cannot conclude very much about the validity of Hayek's or Keynes' ideas. These two guys were the main rivals in the 20th century economics. By the way, if you haven't seen it, you have a possibility to see the video, The Fear of Boom and Bust. You can rap a video in which Hayek and Keynes are debating economic theory. That's hilarious. If you have a chance, just Google Fear of Boom and Bust. It's very precise because one economics professor was an advisor and he wrote most of the lyrics for that. So you have no way of determining, or I think it's foolish. It would be foolish if you were trying to decide about who was right and who was wrong about this or that particular issue, this debate between Hayek and Keynes, by looking at the popularity contest, or what majority of people believe at the time. From 1945 until about 1974-75, 99% believed that Keynes was right and the Hayek was a crackpot. And that's from 1975 until essentially 2008. Free market ideas were much more popular and Keynes was relegated to backward. And now it's a kind of revival of Keynesianism once again, since the financial crisis of 2008. Okay, so this was a slight excursion from Ricardo. So Ricardo is also relevant in this regard because his ideas, once in the 19th century, the entire political economy was Ricardian. So Keynes wrote at one point that Ricardo conquered the English economics with the same completeness as the Spanish Inquisition conquered the Spain. Theory of value. So, the very beginning. Remember, I just sketched out for you this last time. The problem with the theory of value is that there are two different types of goods and that you cannot develop a universal theory that will cover both of them. So it says, it has been observed by Adam Smith that the word value has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. So this is the first distinction between the use value and exchange value. So use value is the ability of a thing to satisfy our consumer needs, its utility. And the second is exchange value. That's the purchasing power of that thing. How many other goods you can buy for one, whatever, a unit of one cup of coffee. But then the exchange value of a cup of coffee is lower than the exchange value of a laptop computer because you can buy fewer loaves of bread for a cup of coffee than for a laptop computer. It's the issue of relative prices here. The exchange ratio between different goods. So that's the exchange rate. And now he formulates what Adam Smith also mentions in the Wealth of Nations, this paradox of value. That you can have extremely useful goods, the necessary for the maintenance of human life, that might not have exchange value at all. And vice versa, that you can have an extremely expensive, high exchange value goods like precious stones. He uses that example. They don't have any apparent utility. This might be like a vanity items. Remember, one of my friend of mine had actually he told me about it. He didn't have this. A piece of paper where John Lennon wrote part of the lyrics for one song. It's like, I don't know how many $1,000 it is worth. Mark Knopfler, if Mark Knopfler was to sell the Fender Stratocaster, this red electric guitar that he used to play the most famous song, I know a couple of my friends in Serbia who would sell their house to get it. It's pure vanity. And yet those goods have this electrical, it's just like any other electrical guitar, Fender Stratocaster, you can buy it for 100 times less money than Mark Knopfler's Fender Stratocaster. So that's the paradox, and he says, now, why is this a problem for economic theory? You want to explain the value of goods and the exchange value. You want your use value to be connected to exchange value. Ideally, you would want to explain the exchange value by the use value, by utility, to derive the price from utility. When I say this like that, you probably recall that's what we do even in microeconomics, introductory courses, this marginal utility, the derivation of the demand curve, prices for marginal utility. Unfortunately, Ricardo and Smith and Marx, they didn't know about that theory. The theory was invented in the 1870s by Carl Menger and William Stanley Jones. So they have a problem now, how to explain the fact that that Rubens's paintings are so expensive that they have such a huge exchange value, and yet their use value may not be greater than any other. So what they decided to do is actually to segregate the goods into two different classes. To say you have those kind of, let's say, scarcity items that people want because of some fashion, because of vanity. On the one hand, he uses the concept of scarcity, but doesn't apply it in a correct fashion as later on. You see later on this concept of scarcity, diminishing returns, as the concept of marginal utility, Ricardo kind of hints at those ideas. He even uses the term diminishing returns, but he uses them in a very clumsy and inconsistent fashion. So you have scarcity goods, and you have what is called reproducible goods. And what he says about the relationship between the two, what is the magic solution that he proposes? What determines the value of reproducible goods, and what determines the value of, we've seen what determines the value of scarcity goods.
Is it labor?
It's the amount of labor which is invested into them. There are some commodities, the value of which is determined by their scarcity alone. That's Third paragraph on the first page. Found it? No labor can increase the quantity of such goods, and therefore their value cannot be lowered by an increased supply. They're only this, what is this? One of the Dutch masters, not Vermeer. It's 7 paintings. The guy did 7 paintings in his entire life. And he's a well-known master, and people would pay millions of dollars to get one of them. There is no 8 Vermeer's painting. No amount of labor will produce a Vermeer painting. So that's a classical scarcity good. There's some rare statues or paintings. Those would be the examples of those scarcity goods. Some rare statues, pictures, scarce books, and then a witness peculiar quality, which can be made only from grapes grown on a particular soil, like champagne. You would say, you would consider Bordeaux wine to be a scarcity good. So normal wine costs $15 a bottle, and you have French wines that cost $300. So you see how bad is this? So you can. So what is the problem with this in your view? Okay, let's assume for a moment that the labor theory of value is the correct theory. So that's the second step that he says. The reproducible goods, their value, that the price, their exchange value, the price that you have to pay is determined by the amount of labor that is invested in its production. What is the problem with this theory?
Takes as much labor to make $200 French wine.
No. Even let's assume for a moment that labor theory of value is a correct theory of price for reproducible goods. What is the problem with the entire conception of scarcity goods and reproducible goods in a scientific sense?
They all have to be equal.
They have to be equal. But why is that a problem for the labor theory of value, that there are those exceptions, scarcity goods and so on? So you want to make a comprehensive theory. So what is the key quality of a scientific theory, of a scientific hypothesis?
Has to be provable.
Okay, that's one thing. Provable, falsifiable, that you can. It's not just some metaphysical nonsense that you cannot make heads or tail about. There must be some kind of way of checking whether that's true or not. We're not now discussing what is that and how, but exactly has to be checkable, provable, falsifiable. What else? It's a crucial thing.
Does it have to? It has to occur consistently.
So,
It has to occur consistently. Like it can't just happen.
okay,
sporadically.
so it's not. Yeah, good. Okay, what else? It's explanatory power. What is that? It has to explain as wide a range of phenomena as possible. A theory that explains, a theory might be perfectly valid, perfectly correct, provable, repeatable, whatever you want, but can explain only a few isolated phenomena. That's probably the first sign that this theory is not a particularly good theory. It's probably just an imperfect approximation of a better, more general theory. So you know, what is the example of a very good theory, Newton's theory of gravity? Why Newton's theory of gravity was revised? What is a better theory that's superseded Newton's theory? It's still very good. Newton's theory can explain a lot of things. Actually, people went to the moon. You don't need any modifications of Newton's theory to build rockets or to build to many things. They explain 99% of all observable phenomena. What is the problem? You observe something that cannot be explained by this theory. That's an automatic signal that your theory is not a complete theory of phenomena that you're looking at. There has to be some modification, some change, some revision of the theory in order to account for the phenomena that you observe exist in reality that you cannot explain. So then Einstein's theory comes along. Einstein's theory of general relativity is an improvement on Newton's theory. Something similar is here. So what is the problem here? It's a good theory. Let's say that the labor theory of value is correct, But then you have a huge problem. What about Vermeer's paintings? What about Bordeaux wine? I mean, Vermeer's paintings and Rubens' paintings. Let's agree that that's an exception. But Bordeaux wine, that's a reproducible thing. That is being made and remade every year. Ferrari cars. Volkswagen is a car. Ferrari is a car. People ready to pay like millions of dollars for certain types of cars. There's a huge amount of goods and services that are produced in the markets that you cannot explain by the labor theory of value. Even if it's correct for those ordinary goods that Ricardo claims it's correct, there is a huge amount of stuff that your theory doesn't explain. And that's the first sign to you that this theory, there is something fishy with this theory, because it cannot explain great amount of phenomena. Okay, what is the labor theory of value? How does Ricardo formulate this theory? That's 273, that's the best formulation. That's the end. Last paragraph for you, it says. If you look to a state of society in which greater improvements have been made. So he's discussing Adam Smith's double theory of value, that you have labor theory for a primitive society and a cost of production theory for a more advanced society. Remember last time we discussed it. And he is now talking about if we look to a state of society in which greater improvements have been made and in which arts and commerce flourish, we shall still find, see, he now corrects Adam Smith. He says labor theory, some kind of labor theory of value would apply even in an advanced society. We shall still find that commodities vary in value conformably in conformity with this principle. In estimating the exchangeable value of stockings, for example, we shall find that their value comparatively with other things depend on the total quantity of labor necessary to manufacture them and bring them to market. And then he lists all kinds of labor that are involved in the entire structure of production, the entire scheme of producing stockings, from the cotton gin and then the labor necessary to collect cotton, and then to spin it, to weave it, and to ships that are necessary to transport it, to shipbuilding industry that is necessary to make ships, to the labor that is necessary to handle stockings, and so on and so forth. So you see, the labor is the key criterion here for determining the exchange value or the price of commodity. Okay, I'm going to just go over a couple of ideas very quickly here, technical ideas, just to give you the sense of the breadth of Ricardo's learning. Page 276. So he has now revision. He enters in, by the way, there is a profit and there is a capital. These also influence the exchange value. It's a slight modification of the labor theory. And he introduces this idea that will become, that is still nowadays a common staple of economics. I wouldn't call it the law of variable proportions, but the law of substitutability of the factors of production. This idea that you can make one thing by using millions of different combinations of different productive factors. It says the first paragraph. In the former section, we have supposed the implements and weapons necessary to kill the deer and salmon to be equally durable. That means the technical instruments of production, and to be the result of the same quantity of labor. And we have seen that the variations in the relative value of deer and salmon depend solely on the varying quantities of labor necessary to obtain them. But in every state of society, the tools, implements, buildings, and machinery employed in different trades may be of various degrees of durability and may require different portions of labor to produce them. The proportions too, this is the key, the proportions too, in which the capital that is to support labor and the capital that is invested in tools, machinery, and buildings may be variously combined. This difference in the degree of durability of fixed capital and this variety in the proportions in which the two sorts of capital may be combined introduce another cause besides the greater or less quantity of labor necessary to produce commodities for the variations of their relative value. This causes the rise or fall in the value of labor. So this idea that you can produce different things by using different combinations of what he calls fixed capital, which would be durable capital, the machines and equipments that are all longer duration, and actually raw materials. They use that variable capital. So you use one machine with two machines, that's fixed capital. It's a fixed investment, you buy them, and they're here for a while. And variable capital would be the raw materials and other less durable materials. So now you can include another machine, or you can increase the amount of raw materials. Marx will even call the labor variable capital. Variable capital. So that's a general idea that you will find later on much refined and further developed by all schools of thought. This idea of variable proportions in which you can use different forms of productive factors to produce anything. And John Bates Clark would be the first to use the term, the law of variable proportions, although Karl Menger developed this idea that you can make anything pretty much by using all kinds of different combinations of different forms of capital and different quantities of labor and capital. And you have capital-intensive industries that use more machinery and equipment, and labor-intensive industries that use more labor and so on. Can you tell me briefly, how did you understand, because we're going to skip comparative advantage, you know that already. I'll tell you what is on page 296, this third and fourth paragraph, that's the key. That's page 296 is the key for comparative advantage. Let's skip that, because we know that already from the textbook presentation. Read that paragraph, but we're not going to spend time on that. Let us see this theory of rent, which is developed 282, 384, 85. How do you understand that? Because that's the key. Maybe we have 10 minutes, maybe just enough time to briefly talk about the relationship between rent, profit, and wages. So what is the rent? What is rent?
Kind of, it's based on like supply and demand.
Yeah,
or rent
but
in like what sense?
Oh, what is the definition of rent as a type of income?
The type of income.
Yeah, it's profit, wage, and rent.
So it's, at least earlier in the text, it was as if when individuals are paying for land or capital from someone that's providing it or not using it adequately.
Okay, so what is the key? The key. Sometimes Ricardo's theory is called Ricardo's theory of differential rent. So the different rents associated with different plots of land. So you notice this principle of diminishing returns is here for the first time employed by Ricardo. You see the same logic that Robinson Crusoe's sacks of corn and so on. The first unit, the second unit, and so on. So when people emerge from barbarism to agriculture, which plots of land will be used first?
Fertile ones.
the most fertile ones, and then less and less fertile ones, and then you have what is this? The diminishing returns on land, which means diminishing productivity of land in making food and all other goods associated with land. So that's the concept of diminishing return. Now, rent. What is the value of rent at the very beginning? What do you think? You see how close he is to the concept of marginal utility. Because scarcity is a source of rent. So they didn't pay attention to some of the implications. It's zero. There is no rent at the beginning. Why? John Locke uses the same. There is enough for everybody. Why would you pay for something that there is enough for everybody? There's plenty of land out there. It's zero. And then, as the scarcity of land increases, as productive power of land, that's one technical term that Marshall would use later on. What is the source of rent? Is the rent is a compensation for an inherent productive power of land, nature. So it has this ability to produce stuff for us. It's fertility. You can redefine it as fertility, productive power, inherent productive power. So the first plots of land that are used have the highest fertility, highest productive power, and yet they don't command the highest rent because of the relative abundance of land. They're not scarce, you don't pay a high price. So you see that he essentially figured out, just didn't formulate the theory in a satisfactory fashion. He didn't use his rent theory as a principle to go back to the first chapter and say, what I'm saying here doesn't make much sense in the view of my rent theory. Actually, it's scarcity that determines price. Scarcity is not an exception. That is irrelevant, but the price is the central player in the price theory. So then, as the land becomes scarcer, rent increases. That's the reason why it's called differential rents. So the land, pieces of land of different degrees of fertility will command different rental incomes. And land that is later on brought into cultivation will have a higher rent associated with it. So page 282, on the first settling of a country in which there is an abundance of rich and fertile land, a very small proportion of which is required to be cultivated for the support of the actual population, or indeed can be cultivated with the capital which the population can command, there will be no rent, for no one would pay for the use of land when there was an abundant quantity not yet appropriated, and therefore at the disposal of whosoever might choose to come. We don't have enough tools and machines, and we don't have enough population to use all the land available while we are not paying. And now, and then instead of saying, aha, okay, when something is abundant, it's cheap and free. When it becomes scarcer, then its price goes up. Okay? That should be the conclusion. Is that the conclusion that he said? Why land has a diminishing return, or why we have to pay paradoxically more and more for rent for pieces of land that are of inferior quality? It's unbelievable. It's the contortions into which we go. Actually, it's because the price of corn that is produced on inferior land will be higher. And it will be higher because it will cost more to produce it. You need more labor hours to produce the same quantity of corn on an inferior land than on a superior land. See? And then the prices of goods and services produced on this inferior land will be more expensive. He said, the most fertile and most favorably situated land will be first cultivated, the next page, 283. And the exchangeable value of its produce will be adjusted in the same manner as the exchangeable value of all other commodities by the total quantity of labor necessary in various forms from first to last to produce it and bring it into market. When land of an inferior quality is taken into cultivation, the exchangeable value of raw produce will rise because more labor is required to produce. The reason then why raw produce rises in comparative value is because more labor is employed, the next page, in the production of the last portion obtained, and not because a rent is paid to the landlord. The value of corn is regulated by the quantity of labor bestowed on its production, on that quality of land. He wants to say that high prices of corn produced on an inferior land is not affected at all by a low quality of land, but just by the price of, by the expenditure necessary for producing it, for wages of labor. Corn is not high in price because a rent is paid, but the rent is paid because corn is high, and price of corn is high because it takes a lot of labor to produce it. So eventually we'll see as the prices increase, the rents will increase. But what's going to happen to wages and profits? This is the last thing. Oh, we're almost all about it. What determines the wages? Remember that. It's the Marx takes this idea in a completely same form. Subsistence theory of wages. The wage is determined by the amount of money and resources necessary to support the existing population, to survive. The reproduction of the labor force, that's a technical term that Ricardo uses, that Marx takes and just translates into German. And we read the English translation of the German translation of the English translation back into English. This is reproduction of the labor force. And then what's going to happen? Then now there is a struggle between profit and wage. As wages increase, why would wages increase as the society progresses? It's like, because now there is a greater population that is necessary to support. You see, he gets completely backwards actually. The prices are determined by the costs necessary to support the existing population. Now, since rents increase, then wages are fixed. Wages cannot be lower because they are necessary to support the population. Rent is increasing because land is scarce, limited. Landowners can blackmail everybody. But by the way, that's the source of this idea that the landowners are parasites, social parasites. That's Ricardo's idea. So then who is this victim? The victim is a poor capitalist whose profits will go down. So another theory that Karl Marx will use and flip it the other way around, the idea of a gradual diminishment or disappearance of the profit rate in a market economy. Okay, this is too complex issue. We're gonna start next time just by once again going very briefly over this wages, rents, and profits dynamic in Ricardo, and then we will move to Malthus, which is a pretty good segue into Malthus because there is a clear correspondence actually that Malthus' essay on population that we're going to be reading flows directly from this exact problem: scarcity of land, population, wages, and so on. That's one and the same problem. So we'll begin with 15-20 minutes talking about Ricardo, and then we will move to Malthus. Okay. Are there any final questions?
The paper, are you gonna push the due date back? The canvas for the Smith and Ricardo.
Oh yeah, I'll move it for whatever, next Monday. Okay, thanks for reminding me. I almost forgot.